It is nice to see such a big group on a nice summer night. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So my name is Leanne Laux-Bachon. I am guest hosting for Jim Gowell, who normally runs the Think and Drink. And I also teach at UW Tacoma, along with our guests tonight. The way this will work for anyone who is new is I will do a quick intro about the event, both the talk that you are hearing tonight and some of our upcoming talks. And then we will go into the talk. And then at the end of that, we'll give the speaker a break for a minute to have a drink of water or whatever. And then we will have a raffle for, or sort of a Q&A guessing game for people to win socks, these Think and Drink socks. The way that works is you will guess some questions that I ask, and the first person to put the correct answer in the chat will win the socks. So there'll be more details on that later. The chat is disabled right now, but I will enable that at the end of the talk. And at that time as well, we can do a Q&A then for the speaker too. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen, and we're looking here, hopefully at the PowerPoint with some more info about this talk. Our talk tonight is from Libby Sunderman, who is an associate teaching professor at UW Tacoma, and it is called Global Themes in World History Since 1500 in 5 Images. And so I'll be telling you a little bit more about Libby in a minute. And then I hope you will join us as well in August. Jim will be back then. Our talk is called Dogs, Rats, and Goats. Oh my, on the, sorry, I have to move my pictures, on the wonderful world of non-human humanitarians. So that sounds very interesting. And actually the giver of that talk is here in the audience tonight too, which is exciting. So let me tell you a little bit about our speaker, and then we will hear from her. So I'm going to go ahead and unshare again. So Libby Sunderman is, like I said, an associate teaching professor of world, modern European, and modern British history at the UW Tacoma. She teaches courses on the British Empire, empires and imperialism, food history, as well as World War I and II. Her main goals are making history teaching and learning educational, practical, and fun. Her research interests range from the world to local history and scholarship of teaching and learning. Her publications include Global Themes in World History Since 1500, For God and Country, Butler's 1944 Education Act, We Do Need an Education, Teaching Pink Floyd The Wall, A Temple of Pleasure, Missoula's Wilma Theater, and History Lab for Undergrads, A Day at the Museum. So, without further ado, let us hear from Libby Sunderman.
Thanks, Leanne. So just let me share my screen real quick. I have a little PowerPoint so that I can show you the images. Everybody see that okay? Okay, so first, just thank you for coming. I honestly wasn't sure how many people would show up for a, Tuesday night talk in the summer. So I appreciate you coming. And I also, I wasn't really sure at first when Jim asked me to do this talk, what I was going to talk about, because the book is a textbook. It's a college textbook as opposed to a monograph. And it's also very broad, covers history since 1500, world history. So I was thinking, how do I condense that down into about a 30 or 40-minute talk? And I decided what to do is pick some images from the textbook and share those with you, just to kind of give you an overview, at least of some of the themes and topics that we looked at. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to do is just give my co-authors some credit here. So this book was written in conversation with Mario Azevedo at Jackson State University, and his specialties are African history, African diaspora history, and he also does healthcare and infectious diseases. So he has a second field that he brings into his history. And then John P. Dunn, who's at Valdosta State University, and his specialties are Middle East, Eastern Europe, China, world military history. And this was great. We all had, there's a little bit of overlap, but mostly we worked in different areas. So it's really good to have that for a world history textbook where you want to cover a lot of topics. I just wanted to talk a little bit about what world history is, and it's actually, I think, more complicated than a lot of people think it is, just in terms of how historians think about it, or there's different ways to teach world history. The way that we approach this textbook and the way that I teach world history is a very broad, more of a thematic kind of journey, as opposed to what you might be used to in history as a chronological journey, which is a way a lot of world historians still teach world history. And then they also try to do a regional focus. So they'll, talk about, Europe in 1500, China in 1500, India in 1500, Ethiopia in 1500, and then move on. And that's not the way I was trained to teach world history. And it's not actually the way I like to teach world history. So use a really broad focus, and looking for connections between those broad themes and topics. And the idea is to kind of look at what humans have in common around the world and throughout time. And so we tried to pick themes that are representative of that. Like any other world history textbook or book or class, we have to make very serious decisions about the periodization that we're going to use, the dates that we're going to look at, and the geography, because as you can imagine, trying to cover 500 years of history in a 10-week course, which is what I do, or if you're teaching World History 1, which is prehistory to 1500, many centuries, you have to find a way to condense it down. And that's the approach we took with the textbook. So as I said here, just pulling out from our introduction, that we tried to do a concise thematic world history textbook for college level students. I'll show you our book right here. It is concise. It's not very long. And we wanted that's something that we decided to do, is to make it a little bit of a smaller textbook. And then I'm going to show you or talk about what the actual topics and themes are. Just one last thing I was going to throw in is we also wanted, this is a decision the authors made, is to allow us to each put our own stamp on the chapters that we wrote. So following the topics and themes that we had decided upon, but allowing us to bring some of our own specialties or interests into those chapters. So here are the chapters, 5 chapters: Atlantic World, Empires and Imperialism, the Global Industrial Revolution, the 20th Century, and then a specialized chapter, Africa on the World Stage. And we were able to have that specialized chapter because we had Mario Azevedo on the team, and he has, that background and expertise in African history. And that's really important. I'll talk about this a little bit again later, but we found that Africa still gets short shrift, even in world history. And a lot of historians in the United States don't have the background in African history unless they've specifically studied African history. So we just thought this is a really great chance to bring in Africa in ways that it's not usually talked about pretty traditionally talked about in terms of the slave trade or European colonization of Africa. And you don't often hear a lot more about it. So Mario was able to change that story for us a little bit. And then the themes that we picked, and these, so we use these themes in each chapter. So there's 5 sections within each chapter. So it's geography and environment, material culture, science and technology, gender and sexuality, and war, peace, and diplomacy. Okay, and so what I'm gonna do is I picked an image from each chapter, and then I also made sure that I had at least one image for each theme. And I'm just gonna take you through those. We'll look at the images. I'll give you a little bit of background about what the image represents to me, or how we represented it in the textbook. Okay, so the first image is from the chapter The Atlantic World, and it is connected to the theme of science and technology. And it's figure 1.5 in the textbook, and it's a view of the botanical garden in St. Vincent in 1825. Sorry, I'm just gonna move your heads around a little bit so I can look at the slide better. So just quickly, because I don't know how much everyone in the audience knows about what the Atlantic world is or what that specifically means to historians, but it refers to obviously the Atlantic Ocean, but specifically the islands and the rimlands of the Atlantic Ocean, and looking at them as a unit of analysis as opposed to looking at them as being different places and having different histories. They have a very complex and connected history. And so this is a way that world historians have really started to look at that area of the world. And of course, this is a place where Europeans practiced settler colonialism. And it's also a place where the Colombian Exchange happened. And again, if you're not familiar with that term, basically it means the transfer of plants, animals, and diseases from Afro-Eurasia to the Americas, and then from the Americas back into Afro-Eurasia. And there's just an amazing transfer of plants and animals that completely reshaped the Americas in just profound ways, which I could go on about this forever because I really like talking about the Colombian Exchange. But where we get into science here is, I think we often take for granted the kind of hard work, centuries of work, and the science that went into domesticating plants. And we tend to forget how hard people labored to have that and the kinds of successes that they had. What happens when Europeans come into the Atlantic world and start interacting, particularly with indigenous peoples, is that they find a whole lot of plants and animals, but we're going to focus on plants tonight, plants that they're really interested in, either as foodstuffs, as raw materials, or they find out they have, for example, medicinal qualities. And they're really interested in learning more about these plants and their uses. If they have an economic aspect to them, if there's something that can be sold, they want to make money off it. So they start transporting plants across the ocean and set up botanical gardens, both back in Europe and then also, as this image shows, in the Caribbean islands. And it's basically a laboratory, an outdoor laboratory, so that they can study these plants, try to grow them. For example, if they take them back to England, they're going to try to see if they can grow them in the native soil, or if they have to have hot houses or special conditions. And this becomes really important, both for the scientific community and also, as I mentioned, because it has economic gains, to the point that we have groups like the Royal Society of Arts offering financial support for successful cultivation of these desirable plants. And then another wrinkle here is that this becomes tied to the slave trade as well. And there's a whole area of scholarship that's starting to look at the connections between European scientific advancements in this time period and the slave trade. And basically what happens is a lot of these plants and seeds are being transported on slave ships. And the slave ships are also often carrying scientists themselves who, say, hey, I heard you're sailing, to the Caribbean or to a particular place, and can I catch a ride? And so there's this whole connection there. And to make matters even worse, we also know that a lot of the information, a lot of the knowledge that the Europeans gained about these plants, they got from indigenous peoples or sometimes enslaved peoples, and took without giving them credit, or used their labor and used their slave labor to gather the plants. And there's a really interesting history there. So just to go back to my first point about how long it takes for people to domesticate plants, and if you think back to the very long history, for example, Native Americans, actually Native Southern Americans, domesticating the potato, which is then something that it takes Europeans a long time to adopt. They're not super psyched about potatoes when they first see them. They think they're kind of ugly, and obviously they don't taste good raw, but they end up being a really important foodstuff around the world. And we tend to forget, how much work would have gone into the domestication of something like the potato to make it edible for humans, or for example, how long it took to take corn from what was a tiny little grass, and to turn it into the huge, beautiful golden cobs we're thought of today. So that's what comes to me from this image. And this is, connected to the science technology, but also definitely something that I'm very interested in terms of the kind of food history that I like to read about and teach about. Okay, the second image, I actually think this image might be my favorite from the entire textbook, both because of the history it represents and then also just on a personal level. So this is from the chapter Empires and Imperialism, and it represents the theme War, Peace, and Diplomacy. And so it's figure 2.7 in the text, and it is shows Maori soldiers in North Africa in 1941. So I was pretty excited when I found this photo. It's just a cool photo of these Maori soldiers, on a break, or maybe they're doing a demonstration for another group there, but they're performing the traditional haka dance while in North Africa fighting in World War II. If you don't know what the haka is, although I think it's become more and more popular, people know about it from, like, for example, the New Zealand All Blacks team. It's defined as a posture dance that involves the entire body in vigorous rhythmic movements, which may include chanting and in some cases by fierce facial expressions meant to intimidate, such as bulging eyes and sticking out of the tongue. And I think you can definitely see, especially with the guy who's in the center of the photo, that he's, doing that kind of facial expression. But what this also represents, and the reason I picked it for this chapter, and I was really lucky, I ended up being having to do most of the work to find images for the textbook, which is a challenge because the publishers don't want you to use images that they're going to have to pay for. So you have to find stuff that's free to use, hopefully in the public domain. This represents how global the world wars really were, and again, World War II in particular for this one. And what I found is in the West, we tend to just remember the Western parts of the war, the European combatants, the Western Front, and we tend to forget that World War II was fought all over the world, that there were different fronts, and that also peoples from all over the world were involved. And specifically here, I'm thinking about troops of color. So the Maori, of course, are the indigenous group from New Zealand. And these troops were often colonial troops or colonial subjects who were brought in to do what I kind of call the dirty work of war, in meaning that they're not getting to do what many people see as the glorious work of fighting on the battlefield, but they're, you know, digging trenches, they're cooking food, they're lugging supplies, what have you. And so we know that Europeans brought in these colonial subjects from all over the world and had them fight. And so this image in particular, like, not only do we have troops of color here who are colonial soldiers fighting for the British Empire, but we have them fighting in North Africa. So they're in the North African Front, which again is a front I don't think we often hear a lot about. But it was actually a really important campaign. So fighting for control of Northern Africa, particularly for the British, looking to continue their influence and management of the Suez Canal. This also ties to what happens after the war, which is many of these troops of color, regardless where they're from, and this is certainly true of African-American troops as well, who went back to the United States, they've been asked to make these sacrifices for their country, to do this hard work for their country, and they've been asked to do it in the name of, you know, freedom and democracy for people around the world, and they find that they are still victims of systemic racism around the world and in their home countries. And in many of the countries that had been colonized by Europeans, we start to see decolonization movements really rise up in the post-World War II movement as a result and a reaction to, you know, the promises they felt like they were being made in the world wars, and that they did not see any of the benefits for themselves. Okay, the third image is from the chapter, The Global Industrial Revolution. And this one, I'm sorry, went back. This one represents material culture. So it's figure 3.2, and it is a steam train on the Cape to Cairo Railway sometime between 1900 and 1915. And we see here a group of people waiting for the train. I don't know if they're getting on or if they're getting off, if they're waiting for things to be unloaded off the train. We get that colonial feel there with the pith helmets that we see several of the men wearing. So when I was thinking about this picture, you know, obviously it could have also gone under the theme of science and technology, but my co-author, Mario Azevedo, chose to talk about material culture in this chapter in terms of coal, and then also the steam train and other technology machinery that came from that. And so he actually opened the chapter by giving a definition of material culture, which I'm going to read to you. He said, material culture, a focus and concept dear to anthropologists and rarely ever mentioned by historians, refers, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, to man-made aspects of culture, such as tools, buildings, weapons, utensils, ornaments, art, monuments, written records, religious images, and clothing, specific to a group of people or culture. And so that's, you know, where we see things like the steam train fitting in. I found it apt, or maybe a little bit funny, that Mario noted that this term is not one traditionally used by historians. But I think I like that he said that, because it shows that by using material culture as one of our themes, we're moving away from the more traditional history and two, one, that I think world history has been really important in opening up, that we want to be more interdisciplinary, and that we've realized that scholars such as anthropologists and others, scientists, really have a lot to offer in terms of how we think about history and the kinds of evidence that we can find. So I certainly think that we might not call it material culture. I think historians usually call it like artifacts, but they are very important to understanding our history as well. And they often tell us stories that we don't get from the kind of traditional textual sources that historians use. So, as I said, Azevedo talks about the steam engine as a piece of material culture, and then also talks a lot about coal to explain it as a catalyst of the European Industrial Revolution. And he called it, or he names it, the demand for an effective source of power to manage the heavy machinery. And there's another entire discussion, fairly broad discussion about coal in world history in terms of its use as a form of energy and its availability around the world. And the idea here is that rather than assuming that some cultures turn to what I'll call, quote unquote, modern forms of energy like coal due to advanced technological prowess, there were specific regional and even, if you will, geological reasons that some cultures turned to coal and that some didn't. And one of the discussions that's been brought up by world historians is coal was really abundant and very easily mined, or relatively easy mined in a place like England. It was also very easy to transport around England because of the waterways that they had. And then also their early links to roads, which were laid down actually by the Romans in Britain. So that is one of the reasons why the British turned to coal. Now, China, which is also a country that, historians argue could have been the ones that broke through to the big, modern industrial revolution, they also had coal, but it was on the outskirts of their country, way out, in the boondocks. It wasn't very accessible to them. It wasn't easy to move around China. And so they made what was a practical decision for them, which is they didn't really have any interest in, this newfangled form of power. It didn't work for them. And they had, things that they were planning on accomplishing that were different. Now, of course, coal ended up being a big deal. How it led into the Industrial Revolution in England, that sparked massive industrialization around the world, is something that they couldn't have predicted. And obviously, we know now that China, has, gone leaps and bounds into their own industrial revolutions through time. But it gives us this idea too, again, that we can't just take industrialization in Europe for granted, that there are these interesting reasons why it happened there. Then I also just wanted to mention here how this image as well, and coal and steam trains and the European industrialization are tied to empires and settler colonialism. And so the British and other European countries were very successful in building railroads in their colonies, including in Africa. And so that's, of course, where this image is taken. And in fact, they began building rail in India in the mid-19th century. And by the 1880s, it constructed thousands of miles of track between major cities. Then in Africa, the British built the Uganda Express. The French constructed the Dakar Niger Railway. Germany developed the Usambara Railway. And this was very important for moving people and goods around their colonies. There are African leaders, one in particular, Menelik II of Ethiopia, who, although he was pretty wary of the Europeans and had successfully fought off colonization of Ethiopia, saw the value in railways and in steam trains. And he did build railroad that linked major cities in Ethiopia, and helped actually support Ethiopian power in Africa against European imperialism. So again, there's just a whole lot of things that we can connect or pull out of this one image. Okay, the next photo comes from the chapter on the 20th century. And this theme it represents is gender and sexuality. And so it's figure 4.5, women celebrating International Women's Day in Cameroon in 2015. So I kind of like to say the 20th century chapter is kind of a long 20th century. We dip a little bit into the 19th century and we dip a little bit into the 21st century. And this actually was the only image of women celebrating International Women's Day that I could find. I love it, but I just was going to kind of fudge the fact that it was from 2015 and not, specifically from the 20th century. So in this chapter, in our section on gender and sexuality, we looked at global women's rights, including women's suffrage, and then also limitations to women's rights around the world. So I'm just going to give you a couple highlights of some of the material that we put forward. So in 1979, the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, made clear, quote, despite various international human rights declarations, covenants, and specialized agencies, extensive discrimination against women continues to exist. And so this 1979 convention, which is sometimes called an International Bill of Rights for Women, worked to change that and to try to expand and internationalize a wide swath of women's rights and fight against a very broadly defined ideas of discrimination against women. By 1999, 163 countries around the world had ratified CEDAW, with notable exceptions, including the United States. In many countries, including some of those that had ratified it, lodged reservations about sections of the agreement that conflicted with local laws or customs. And I think this is one of the problems that we may see with international agreements, is that it may be hard to make sure that they, I guess, are culturally sensitive or culturally appropriate to all peoples around the world. And as well with international agreements and international bodies, they were also limited in their ability to monitor and regulate adherence to this pact. And so its overall international effectiveness has not been what they hoped it would be, but progress has been made. Another thing we looked at was just the women's right to vote. And this was just an interesting timeline. And I was actually really surprised to find this out, that it's actually New Zealand, where women were first given the vote. It was in 1893. So again, I'm sneaking a little bit out of the 20th century there, but I wanted to start with that date. There's a whole list of where and when women got the vote throughout the 20th century. And we know that some women, of course, had to wait until the 21st century to gain that right. So countries in the Middle East, for example, have just begun to give women those rights in the past few years, or the past decade or so. The other thing that we wanted to discuss, even though, I think this photo, it's a beautiful photo, and I don't know, it's like full of hope for me and celebration for international women's rights. But we didn't want to just assume that the kinds of advances that we've seen in some countries, and certainly the kinds of advances we've seen in the United States relative to other countries in the world, was the end of the story, and I should say in our country, in the United States specifically, for white women. So we talked a little bit about the flip side to this, and looked at a 1998 report by the Human Rights Watch Women's Rights Project, who argued that despite the impressive progress made by women's human rights movements, quote, throughout the world, women are still relegated to second-class status that makes them more vulnerable to abuse and less able to protect themselves from discrimination. And so they looked at a variety of abuses, things like using rape as a weapon of war, sexual assault against refugees and displaced women, sexual trafficking, forced prostitution and marriage, reproductive and sexual rights violations, domestic violence, and other causes of abuse against women, for example, in the workplace. And refugee, displaced, and Indigenous women were often the most vulnerable groups, in part because they often face what is called intersectional discrimination. So just for example, migrants might be fleeing violence while also facing abuses abroad related to their sex and perceived identities. Indigenous women face discrimination, not just as women, but also as Indigenous people. And to make matters worse, because of the status of these women in many societies, the abuse against them goes undocumented. But we did have, a positive story, or at least a somewhat positive story to tell in response to that, and that is how Indigenous women have organized to fight this discrimination. And so just one piece of that starts on Valentine's Day in 1992, following the murder of a local Indigenous woman. Residents of downtown Eastside Vancouver, British Columbia, began the Women's Memorial March to recognize and honor women who are now recognized by the title Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women, or MMIW. And this is getting growing international attention. It's certainly not getting all the attention it deserves, but it has been more widely recognized by the United States and by Canada in the past few years. The statistics are pretty shocking. In 2010, official statistics revealed that Indigenous women in Canada were 6 times more likely to be murdered, and that in the United States, they were 2 times more likely to be victims of sexual assault. So that's what we built in text around this image and other images in that chapter. Okay, so the final image comes from Africa on the World Stage, and this one represents geography and environment, and it is figure 5.2, Mount Kilimanjaro from space. There wasn't a date on this. I know it's fairly recent. The closest date I could find on the site that I got it from was that it was acquired in 2016. But it's, a relatively recent image. And I like this image because, well, it's just I think it's kind of a cool image just to, see this, amazing mountain from space. But it also was compelling to me because of the text that was put on it to help us see the various ecosystems on and around Mount Kilimanjaro. So this includes things like alpine climates, alpine deserts, and what is called the moorland in between them. So I think you can see the text here that shows us that. And of course, this is just a snippet of African of geography of the African continent. So one of the things we wanted to do in this chapter, and is also something that I've started to do in my World History 2 class, specifically in response to having worked on this textbook and now being able to use it in my classes, is to really try to challenge my students to think about the stereotypes that they have grown up hearing about Africa, learn more about Africa, and then get rid of those stereotypes. And one of the things that we found is that, many people do not understand how diverse Africa is. In fact, unfortunately, there are still people who call Africa a country, don't realize that it's actually a continent made up of, I think it's 54 different countries. And then of course, if you, think about how huge Africa is, has a lot of diversity, but people, tend to think that it's either desert or these kinds of savanna grasslands, where lions, zebra, and giraffes live. And so, as Azevedo stated in his chapter, he said Africa is rich in geographic diversity, and it has 5 predominant ecosystems, including coastal environments, deserts and semi-deserts, mountain environments, savanna, grasslands, and forests. And each is different, and something that world historians know, and I think many of us can appreciate, is that depending on the geography and the climate where you live, or where your culture developed, it has a lot of impact on your culture as well. And so it can help us understand why there is so much diversity around the world that is tied to geography and climate. And I just looked up a couple of other statistics about the diversity of Africa. And there's a webpage from Portland State University that says that, there is this amazingly diverse collection of plant and animal life. So more than 50,000 known plant species, 1,000 mammal species, and 1,500 bird species. And I had mentioned earlier, part of the rationale we had in terms of asking Azevedo to write this chapter, because we wanted to be able to, use his expertise. And he also is African by birth, although he lives and works in the United States today, to be able to give more information to our students about African history beyond, as I said, the pretty traditional discussions and important discussions of the transatlantic slave trade and European colonization in Africa. And I was just going to read you just the first few lines of how he opened the chapter. And he said, globally, the history of Africa can figuratively be compared to a ping pong ball, constantly in an up and down motion, whose trajectory is difficult to predict. If one reads what has been written from the beginning of modern history to the present, the general narrative on Africa has been negative, and its achievements have been either ignored or distorted to fit an image that those outside the continent have decided to project and maintain, often for very obvious motives. This chapter attempts to straighten the unfair wrongs Africa has suffered, highlight its accomplishments, expose its serious challenges and past unforgivable decisions, and provide a personal perspective of its future, using the broadest acceptable and hopefully objective criteria that have been applied to other people of the world. And I think he does that in his chapter. And I certainly know my students have been very vocal in their appreciation of the unit that we now do on Africa, saying that they've, never really learned anything about Africa, that they do recognize that what we often see in the media or in movies in the United States are the stereotypes, and often, racist stereotypes of Africa. And so again, we hope this chapter in the textbook and some of the images that we included can help steer students toward a better understanding of Africa. Okay, so that is my 5 images. We took kind of a sweeping look at world history and global themes, which I hope I led you to expect. And so I will let Leanne take over again. I think she's going to try to give away some socks. And thank you very much for listening.
Yeah, thank you, Libby. I am going to give away some socks. And I was going to try to do a question from, have my question be from the presentation. I have just enabled the chat, so you'll be able to type your answer in the chat. And the way this works is, these are the socks, the Grit City Think and Drink socks. So if you have an answer to a question that I'll ask, the first person to put it in the chat can win a pair of socks. We'll have 2 different questions, so 2 chances to win. And the way it works is then you will also message me, just me, your address, and then Jim Gowell, who normally hosts this, he will mail you those socks. It's a delightfully analog experience, hopefully. So Jim sometimes just does random questions, but I thought I would be sort of more tied into the talk with my questions. So what is one of the chapters of Libby's book? One of the topics, one of the chapters of this textbook. The first person who can put that in the chat can win some socks. Okay, Ben. Michi says the Atlantic world. Very good, Ben. You get a pair of socks. Okay, and now, yes, thanks for the applause. That's good. Okay, and now you might have guessed my second question for the second pair of socks. I know, very fast. Is what is one of the themes of Libby's book? One of the themes, oh, and Janet McDaniel has said material culture, and she is right. So Ben and Janet, congratulations on your socks. Very fast people here. So what we are going to do is we're now going to have a Q&A for Libby. And again, you can use the chat to put your questions in there. And I will be monitoring the chat and I will read the questions and Libby will answer them. You know, go ahead and put your questions in as you have them and I can start us off on one. It's something that Jim does as well too sometimes. And that was a question, one question I had was about sort of like the structure of the textbook and how you landed on the different sections in particular, because it seems like kind of as you were saying, the empire and imperialism chapter or theme could really be found in so many of these. So I guess I wondered, like, when you were coming up with your 5 areas of focus, how did you, can you say a little bit about how you kind of narrowed it or expanded it in a way that was maybe different from some other textbooks that are out there? And while Libby's answering that, just a reminder, if you have questions for her, put those in the chat.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's definitely different than most of the other world history textbooks that I've seen, which do tend to be a little bit, I don't want to say traditional because they're very well done. So I'm not using traditional in like a negative sense, but they're more traditional than the way I approach world history. And, you know, this was a really long project. When we started, the 4 authors that started the project, we just came up with the chapter topics that we wanted to look at. They were actually a little bit different back in the beginning. And unfortunately, we lost 3 authors and got 3 new authors and then lost those 3 authors. And finally, I was able to get Mario and John to actually like be able to commit and write the book. And so I think we just picked, you know, really big themes that cover this 500 years. Definitely, I think some of our own interests played into the themes that we picked. So even, I mean, Atlantic world is something that's a pretty common theme anymore, discussed in world history, but it's something I'm definitely particularly interested in, particularly in terms of the Colombian Exchange and the food history. You know, the chapter on Africa was one we added late in the game, but it was definitely because of Mario's expertise. I think empires and imperialism really are a really important part of that 500-year span. And although we did try to make it not focus just on Europe's actions as empires, but to also look at the interactions between Europeans and the people that they colonized, and how I was just talking to my students in World Empires about this, the scholarship and the truth that people in the colonies shaped the Europeans very profoundly, despite the power differential. And I don't think you can do this time period without talking about the Industrial Revolution. So some of it is just kind of like traditional, like things you have to talk about in this time period, and some of it was inspired by our own personal interests.
Thank you. So we've got a couple questions in the chat. Thank you for those. I'll read those out. Steve would like to know, were there other themes that you considered and rejected?
Yeah, originally there was going to be a chapter that looked at more specifically at exploration, but we were going to include not just, again, the kind of traditional Western civ exploration you hear about from Europeans traveling across the Atlantic. There's really important travel both by land and water that's happening actually in the time period just before 1500 that many world historians have argued really shapes what happens after 1500. And we had originally we had a scholar who did Asian history who was going to talk more about that and talk about the importance of the Chinese in terms of both their trade on land routes and on sea routes. And that ended up going, we kept a snippet of it in a chapter where we just mentioned that precursor of the importance of the Chinese and earlier sailing technology to the Europeans being able to capture and transition that technology for their own needs in the Atlantic Ocean. There was another chapter, and this is way back when we first started talking about this, that was going to be, I think it was going to be on like global intellectual trends. That was not a chapter that I was going to have much to do with. This is not really in my wheelhouse, but we had an author that was really excited about that. Those are the only two I can think off the top of my head right now.
Okay, thank you. Several additional great questions here. The next one is from Tony, and he asks, what has student response been to the thematic history rather than chronological or geographic?
Yeah, so I find students really like it. I mean, this is generally my approach in all of the courses that I teach, with the exception of, I teach a 20th century Britain course, which is really should be called 20th century England, because that's what I was trained in is English history. And that's the most traditional of my courses. It's just a century. It's really just one country, so it's much more traditional. But I really like the very broad strokes and you do these broad strokes, but then you find connections between them. And I find students really respond to it well. It also keeps us away from, I mean, I don't put a lot of focus on memorization of dates and names and events. For one, if you need to know that, you can Google it at any time. And two, as long as you have like a broad idea or general idea of what happened when, I think that's enough. So I've had students who really react really positively to it. And what they find really interesting are then the connections that you can make between these between these themes. And I think, I mean, I hope a little bit of that came across in some of the images I was talking about, where it seems like it's just this image of this, like of a train, but there's like all of these things that you can connect it to.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Janet would like to know, she asked, how much weight / attention did you give to Asia? Mostly your presentation gave examples from Europe, Americas, and Africa, just wondering. And I feel like you kind of addressed that a little bit earlier, but yeah.
Yeah, no, and that's a great question. And the answer is, yeah, Asia does not get as much attention as it probably should. We did not have, unfortunately, an Asian historian to help us with this. I know there's more about Asia in the sections on war, peace, and diplomacy, which were written by John Dunn, and he ended up really writing almost all of the sections on war, peace, and diplomacy in each of the chapters, because that's his specialty. And I know he talks a lot more about Asia in those chapters. And then, as I mentioned, in G's, I can't remember if it's in the Atlantic world or in Empires and Imperialism, where I make a quick shift to saying, hey, by the way, the Chinese were doing this really important trade and exploration before we get to the story of Europe. But yeah, I mean, I'm sorry to say that, you know, Asia does get short shrift. I try to make that up a little bit in my classes there's a really great website by Asia for Educators that looks at some of the ideas I brought up about, you know, why did Europe industrialize instead of China? Brings up the whole idea about coal in England instead of China. And so I try to bring in Asia in that way. But yeah, that's definitely something that's missing. And if we did do a second edition, I think we definitely want to get an Asian historian to give us some help.
Okay, thank you. And our next question, and just a reminder, if you've thought of any additional questions, please put those in the chat. We can take a little bit more time for our chat. The next question is from Ben, and he says, Libby, this sounds like a really wonderful effort to shift how we do world history. My question is about the turn to imagery / the visual as a mode of history. I guess I am curious if you have any thoughts about whether visually narrating history reinforces or complicates some of the anti-colonialism of the project.
Okay, so I might have to have Ben weigh in here. So I think what I think you're asking, Ben, is because a lot of the visuals and imagery from a lot of these time periods tend to both be, well, from a Western gaze or produced by Westerners, that it tends to have racism kind of baked into it. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
And Ben says partly.
Okay. I need more than that, Ben. So, so I get, I mean, I'll give you, so we'll use that partly part. And there is an image in the book that I thought about showing tonight, and I decided not to, because it's a really horrible image. It's a soap ad from Pear's Soap, and they are notorious for their racist and imperialist advertising in the 19th century. And it is an image of two children. I think they're both boys. I'm trying to find it in the text right now. Anyway, one of them is a young man of color, and he is taking a bath, and the other boys, a white boy is kind of, you know, coaching him on how to take a bath. And then the next panel is the little boy of color has gotten down to the bathtub and everything from neck down is white, because he's used Pear soap, and Pear soap, you know, has these magical qualities of you know, making you more Western, making you more white. And so those are, I mean, those are images that are really difficult to show and to talk to students about, but I think that it's important to show them and talk about them in terms of helping students understand that, you know, that this so much of this story has been taught or has been written by a white Western audience, and that, you know, we need to, you know, we need to look at that history because we need to understand it, and we need to try to understand why people thought that way and did those things, because that's what historians do. But that we don't have to accept it today. We don't have to condone it. In fact, I have a whole what I call like a course guidelines or history guidelines assignment that I put in my course just this last year, working with some of our folks from the DEI office, about, you know, the difficult topics that we have to talk about in history, and that we are going to see, you know, a lot of examples of racism, sexism, and so on. And, you know, how do we look at those and use them to do our work as historians without, you know, re-promoting them or condoning them, and also, you know, with that they have, you know, these, it cause, you know, these personal reactions, and how do we, you know, kind of put ourselves away from that a little bit, to try to deal with them as more objective historians. So it's difficult, and I don't know if I answered Ben's question, but Ben, you and I can chat another time too.
Yeah, and he did an additional comment in the chat. He said, yes, the other aspect is trying to think about modes of doing history, so visual versus oral. And he said, visual history strikes me as an evolution from a strong textual tradition.
Yeah, so, sorry. Yeah, I mean, I find a lot of students, you know, they really want more visual stuff. They want images, you know, they want videos that, again, often have historical images in it. So, I mean, I do try to bring a lot more visuals, artifacts, museum visits into my history classes, and we still do a lot of reading. But, you know, I do think there are new and better ways of doing history besides just reading and visiting the textual archives. So I do try to do that, and I think that is something that's happening in the profession overall. Sorry, I'm reading Ben's message to me.
Oh, okay.
He's got childcare going on.
Oh, okay. So these have been such great questions and such a great talk. As we're getting ready to wrap up, any final questions for Libby? Please put those in the chat if you do have them. I guess I have one final one while I'm giving people an opportunity to write, and that is, I was really interested in the railroad picture in part because it had what I would think of as sort of a long, but I'm not a historian, like sort of a long span of, when is this picture from?
Oh, when is it from?
Yeah, no, because it said 1900 to 1915, and so that was interesting that it's like, you know, we sort of know it's somewhere in there, but I guess my question was just, what is it, how with pictures that we can't declare like this is the year, how do you narrow it down like that, and what is considered sort of a is that a long range to be like it's somewhere in there? Or is that more of a non-historian being like, oh, 15 years is a long time to not know? I realize that.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. That's an interesting question. I think that there's a couple ways to answer that question. One is that, wherever the original photo came from, you might be able to pinpoint about the time it was taken if it's not dated, just like where you found it. Like if you found it in someone's, personal collection, or maybe a scrapbook that they kept, like you might be able to like pinpoint the dates more closely. Like you may be able to say, oh, well, they were, we know that they were in that area in between these time periods, so that's what they would have been able to take it. And I suppose, historians too, who really know the time period, or really know the machinery, could probably, look at the train and say, oh, that's, this model or whatever, and that's, when it would have been in this area. Yeah, 15 years. I mean, I don't think I usually see them dated like quite that far apart, but I do think 15 years for that time period and in that area of the world probably isn't like a super long time. They might not have been changing the railroad a whole lot, or the fashions a whole lot in that time period. So, I don't think it's like a huge span of time for that particular image. But yeah, that's a really interesting question.
Thanks. Okay, well, looking at the chat, I don't see any further questions from anyone. So thank you all so much for being here. Thank you so much to our speaker, Libby. And as a reminder, Ben, one of our participants, one of our SOC winners, he will be giving the Think and Drink talk next month on August 10th. So please consider coming and checking that out. And thank you again all so much for being here. There he is.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to there's just been a couple of comments in the chat. Just thank yous to me, and I just say thank you to all of you for coming and having an interest in hearing about a textbook, which I was joking with Leanne about. I'm like, who wants to listen to something about a textbook? But I hope you enjoyed it.
But there were all these people that were here. That's great. Thank you so much, everybody. Okay, well, we will see you in August.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye, Ben and kids.